Eleanor Vance felt herself dissolving. It was a slow, quiet process, like a watercolour left in the sun, the vibrancy of her presence fading with each passing year, until she was little more than a pale outline of a person. At the Duke of Alistair's dinner table, amidst the bloom of jewels and the bright plumage of debutantes, she was a ghost in grey silk. A companion brought along by her cousin Clara, out of a weary sense of familial duty. She had long perfected the art of being unobtrusive. She kept her eyes on her plate, her hands in her lap, her opinions tucked away with the worn gloves she could not afford to replace. She was 27 years old, a spinster with a negligible annuity and a talent for miniature painting that society deemed a quaint, useless hobby. Her world had shrunk to the size of the tiny ivory discs she worked on, filled with details no one else ever bothered to notice. Tonight, she noticed everything. She saw the way Lady Annalise tilted her head, a practiced motion designed to catch the candlelight in her diamond earrings. She saw the nervous tremor in young Lord Harrington's hand as he reached for his wine, his first time dining at Alistair House. And she saw the Duke. Julian Croft, the Duke of Alistair, was a man carved from stillness. He did not preside over his table, he anchored it, a point of silent gravity around which all the frantic orbiting of social ambition took place. He was not handsome in the poetic sense. His features were too severe, his jaw too resolute. His distinction was a profound, unnerving quietude. While others performed, he simply was. His only nervous habit, she noted, was the slow, repetitive motion of his thumb polishing the surface of his signet ring. It was the only part of him that seemed restless. She said nothing all evening, offering only a small, polite smile when addressed directly, which was blessedly infrequent. She listened to the talk of politics and horses and the upcoming season, feeling the conversation wash over her like a tide that could never reach her distant shore. She was a footnote in a story she was not part of, and she was content with that. Anonymity was a form of safety. When Clara signalled that it was time to depart, Eleanor arose with a sense of relief so profound it was almost painful. She gathered her thin shawl, her gaze sweeping the room one last time. For a single, startling second, her eyes met the Duke's from across the length of the table. There was no warmth in his look, no polite inquiry. It was a look of pure, unadulterated assessment, sharp and focused, as if he were a hawk spotting a field mouse from a great height. Her breath caught in her throat. Then the moment was gone. He was nodding to another guest, the shutters drawn once more. She left with Clara, the chill of the May evening a welcome shock against her warm skin. She did not imagine she had made any impression at all. She was a ghost, after all. Ghosts are not meant to be remembered. The next morning, the world tilted on its axis. A footman in the Alistair livery, crisp and immaculate, arrived at the modest boarding house where she and Clara were staying. He did not ask for Clara. He presented a thick, cream-coloured card on a silver tray. The card bore a single name, Miss Eleanor Vance. Clara was aghast. "What could the Duke possibly want with you?" she asked, her voice a mixture of suspicion and envy. Eleonora had no answer. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She held the card, the sharp edges pressing into her palm. It felt like a summons, or a verdict. Her mind raced through the dinner, searching for some misstep, some unintended offence. Had she used the wrong fork? Spilled a drop of water? Met his gaze for a fraction of a second too long? She dressed in her only other respectable gown, a deep blue muslin that had seen better days, her hands shaking as she fastened the buttons. The Duke's carriage waited outside, a silent, gleaming beast of lacquer and leather that seemed to mock the peeling paint of the boarding house. The ride to Alistair House was short and surreal. She felt as if she were moving through a dream, the familiar streets of London strange and menacing. The butler, a man named Hemlock, who seemed as ancient and unyielding as the oak door he opened, led her through halls that echoed with a profound silence. The house had been full of noise and light last night. Now it was a museum of shadows and whispers. He did not lead her to a formal receiving room, but to a smaller, more intimate study. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, their leather spines a tapestry of gold and brown. A fire crackled in the hearth, though the day was not cold. The Duke of Alistair stood by the window, his back to her. He was not in formal attire, but in a simple dark coat and trousers, which somehow made him seem larger, more imposing. He turned as the door closed, and the room shrank around him. "Miss Vance," he said. His voice was not loud, but it filled the space entirely. "Thank you for coming. Your Grace," she murmured, her throat tight. She curtsied, her eyes fixed on a point on the Turkish carpet. He did not ask her to sit. He simply watched her for a long moment, that same unnerving, assessing gaze from the night before. His thumb was tracing the edge of his ring, over and over. "You are an artist," he stated. It was not a question. Eleonora's head snapped up in surprise. I paint a little, for my own amusement." He moved to the large mahogany desk that dominated the room. On its polished surface, nestled on a square of velvet, was a small ivory disc. Her heart stopped. It was her unfinished miniature of a robin, its breast a smear of hopeful red. The eye a mere speck of black ink. She had been working on it yesterday, and in her haste to prepare for the dinner, she must have dropped it from her reticule in the carriage. "My man found this when cleaning the carriage your cousin hired," he explained, his tone even. The driver knew it belonged to one of his passengers from this address. "I am so sorry, Your Grace," she stammered, heat flooding her cheeks. "It is of no value, a trifle." "I disagree," he said flatly. He gestured for her to approach. Hesitantly, she moved closer to the desk. He was right beside her now, his presence a palpable force. He smelled of old paper and winter air. "I see a great deal of value in it. You have captured the truth of the thing, not just its shape, but its character, its fragility." He looked from the miniature to her, and for the first time she saw something other than cold assessment in his dark, coffee-brown eyes. It was a flicker of intense, focused interest. It was more unnerving than his indifference. "I have a proposition for you, Miss Vance," he said, his voice dropping slightly. "A commission, a bargain, if you will." Eleonora could only stare at him, her mind a blank slate. A bargain with the Duke of Alistair? It was absurd. It was impossible. "I do not understand, Your Grace." "I require a series of miniatures," he continued, as if explaining a simple business transaction. 12 of them. Specific subjects, interiors of this house, objects, landscapes from the estate grounds. For this I will pay you £10,000. The number hung in the air between them, shimmering and unreal. £10,000. It was more money than she could imagine, a sum that would not just change her life but create a new one entirely. It was freedom. It was security. It was everything she had never dared to hope for. The words of the bargain settled between them like dust on forgotten furniture, altering the very atmosphere of the room. Why? The word escaped her before she could stop it. It was impertinent, foolish, a flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, or regret, crossed his face. "My reasons are my own. The work requires discretion. You would need to be here at Alistair House for the duration of the work. I estimate 3 months. You would be given rooms and your privacy would be respected. Those are my terms. Do you accept? Her mind reeled. To live in this house, to work under his roof, to be the subject of the inevitable vicious gossip that would follow. It was a terrifying prospect, but the alternative was a slow, genteel slide into impoverished obscurity, forever dependent on the fickle charity of relatives like Clara. It was a lifetime of being a ghost. She looked at her tiny, unfinished robin on his desk. He had seen its value. He had seen her. For the first time in a very long time, she felt solid, real. "Yes, Your Grace," Eleonora said, her voice clearer and stronger than she had expected. "I accept." The first week was an exercise in strained formality. Eleonora was installed in a suite of rooms in a quiet wing of the house, far from the family apartments. The rooms were larger than the entire floor she shared with Clara at the boarding house. Furnished with elegant but faded furniture that spoke of generations of use. Her life was governed by a quiet, efficient routine. Breakfast was brought to her room. She would spend the day in whichever location the Duke had designated, sketching and preparing her ivory discs. Her first subject was the library where they had struck their bargain. She spent days there, from morning until the light failed, capturing the play of sun on the leather-bound books, the intricate carving of the mantelpiece, the very quality of the scholarly silence. The Duke was rarely present. He would appear without warning, stand behind her for a few minutes watching her work, his presence a heavy weight in the room, and then leave without a word. Their conversations were brief and stilted, focused entirely on the logistics of her work. He would provide her with a list of subjects. She would tell him what supplies she needed. He was polite, distant, and utterly unreadable. She felt less like a guest and more like a curious piece of clockwork he had acquired, one he was observing to see how it functioned. Yet there were moments, small cracks in his formidable armour. One afternoon, while she was struggling to capture the precise shade of blue in a Spurs vase, he entered the room and placed a small, dark red rose in a bud vase on the table beside her. "The light in this room drains the warmth from colour," he said simply. "This may help you find the balance." He left before she could thank him. The rose sat beside her, a startling splash of life against the sombre tones of the room. It felt like a secret message she could not decipher. Another time, she was sketching the aviary in the West Garden. It was a beautiful but melancholy place, filled with exotic birds who chirped and fluttered behind gilded wires. The Duke found her there, her sketchbook open on her lap. "My great-grandfather built this," he said, his voice softer than usual. "He believed that if you caged something beautiful, you could own its beauty." He paused, his gaze on a bright yellow canary. He was a fool. All he owned was its sorrow. It was the most personal thing he had ever said to her. She looked up at him, at the hard line of his jaw and the unexpected sadness in his eyes, and saw a man as captive as the birds. The observation lodged in her heart, a tiny seed of understanding. Her work became her entire world. She poured all of her quiet, focused attention into the miniatures. She painted the grand ballroom, not filled with people, but empty and echoing, the chandeliers like frozen tears. She painted a single, chipped teacup in the morning room, a relic of a past generation. She painted the view from his study window, the ancient oak tree that dominated the lawn. Each image was imbued with a sense of profound stillness, of a great house holding its breath. She knew, of course, that her presence had not gone unnoticed. Clara had written a frantic, scandalized letter. Whispers followed her when she took her prescribed walks in the garden. She was the Duke's mysterious project, his pet artist, or, as the more salacious rumours suggested, his prospective mistress. The pressure of society's gaze was immense, a physical force she had to push against every day. One evening, a small dinner party was unavoidable. A political ally of the Duke's, Lord Ashworth, was visiting with his wife. Eleonora was expected to join them. She dreaded it, the feeling of being on display, of having to justify her existence in this house. Lady Ashworth, a woman with a face like a startled pug, made her opinion clear from the outset. "An artist, you say?" she asked, her voice dripping with condescension as she examined Eleonora's simple dress. "How? Novel? And you are painting the house, Alistair? Are you planning to redecorate?" "Miss Vance is creating a record," the Duke replied smoothly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Her eye is more accurate than any architect's diagram." But Lord Ashworth, emboldened by wine, was less subtle. "A record for what, eh? A man like you doesn't commission art without a purpose. Perhaps a gift for a future duchess to show her the prize she's won?" He winked crudely at Eleonora. A hot, suffocating shame washed over her. She felt her carefully constructed composure begin to crumble. She was nothing to them but an object of speculation, a pawn in a game she didn't understand. She opened her mouth to offer a quiet, self-deprecating deflection, the kind she had used her entire life to smooth over awkward moments. But before she could speak, the Duke set his wine glass down with a soft, deliberate click. The sound cut through the conversation like a shard of glass. "Lord Ashworth," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Miss Vance is a professional engaged in a significant commission. Her talent is the only subject worthy of discussion. I will not have her or her work disrespected at my table." The silence that followed was absolute. Lord Ashworth paled, stammering an apology. Lady Ashworth suddenly became fascinated by the pattern on her plate. The Duke had not raised his voice, had not made a single aggressive move, but he had drawn a line of iron around Eleonora. He had protected her. In that moment, she was not his employee or his secret. She was under his care. The realization was as terrifying as it was exhilarating. Later that night, unable to sleep, she walked the silent corridors of the house. She found herself outside the gallery, a room she had not yet been asked to paint. The door was slightly ajar. Drawn by an impulse she could not name, she slipped inside. The room was filled with the collected treasures of the Croft dynasty. But in the centre of the room, on a pedestal, was something different. It was a clockwork bird, exquisitely made of silver and gold, but it was broken. One wing was bent at an awkward angle, and a web of cracks ran across the enamel of its breast. It was flawed, imperfect, but it was clearly cherished. She heard a footstep behind her, and turned, her heart leaping into her throat. The Duke stood in the doorway. He was not angry. He just looked tired, the shadows under his eyes deeper than she had ever seen them. "It was my mother's," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she could not identify. She loved it more than any of the perfect things in this house. She said it was beautiful because it was broken. It had a story. He walked over to stand beside her, their shoulders almost touching. He looked at the broken bird, and the mask of the inscrutable Duke fell away completely. In its place was just a man, haunted by a memory. The air between them thickened, charged with unspoken words. This was the crack in his armour, a glimpse into the guarded fortress of his heart. And Eleonora, the quiet observer, saw it all. The revelation of the broken clockwork bird shifted something between them. The formal distance remained, but it was now threaded with a delicate, unspoken understanding. He began to seek her out more often, not just to observe her work, but to talk. He would appear in the late afternoon with 2 cups of tea, sitting in a chair near her easel while she mixed her colours. He asked about her life, about her childhood, about how she had come to paint in such a small, precise medium. She found herself telling him things she had never told anyone, of her quiet, lonely youth, of the way she would retreat into creating tiny, perfect worlds on ivory, because the real one was so often disappointing and cruel. He listened with that unnerving stillness of his, but it no longer felt like assessment. It felt like attention. Why these specific scenes? She finally dared to ask one rainy afternoon. She had just finished a detailed miniature of the ancient gnarled wisteria that climbed the south-facing wall of the house. The empty ballroom, the forgotten teacup, the view from this window, they are all so solitary. He was silent for a long time, his thumb tracing the rim of his teacup. A motion that had become as familiar to her as the beat of her own heart. They are memories, he said at last, his voice low. They are places where she was happy. She? Eleonora asked softly. He rose and walked to the window, looking out at the rain-soaked gardens. My mother, he said, the words costing him a visible effort. The Dowager Duchess. Eleonora knew of the Dowager Duchess, of course. Society gossip painted her as a cold, difficult woman who had abandoned her son and her duties years ago, choosing to live in seclusion on a remote coastal estate after a bitter falling out with the late Duke. She is unwell, Julian continued, his back still to her. She will not travel. She will never see this house again. He turned to face her, and the pain in his eyes was so raw and exposed it made her ache. We have not spoken in 10 years. Not since my father's death. There were things said. Accusations, a chasm of pride and anger that neither of us was willing to cross. He walked over to a bookshelf and pulled down a small, leather-bound volume. He opened it to reveal a faded portrait, not a photograph, but a skillfully rendered drawing of a woman with his dark eyes and a smile that was both sad and defiant. She loved this house, he whispered. Every stone, every crooked floorboard. My father wanted to tear down the old conservatory, and she stood in front of the demolition crew and refused to move. He called her stubborn. She said she was protecting the soul of the place. Suddenly, it all made sense. The commission, the secrecy, the specific, lonely subjects. He was not creating a record for a future bride. He was sending his mother her home. He was trying to bridge that 10-year chasm of silence and pride, not with words of apology, which he could not bring himself to speak, but with images. He was sending her the soul of the place she had loved. She is dying, isn't she? Eleonora said. It was not a question. He flinched as if she had struck him. He gave a single sharp nod, his jaw tight. Her physicians give her until the autumn. He stood there, the powerful Duke of Alistair, completely undone by a grief he had carried alone for a decade. He was vulnerable, human, and achingly lonely. He had built walls of duty and discipline around his heart, and now she was inside them. She held his secret, the painful, tender truth that explained everything. He had let her see the broken, cherished parts of his own story, and in doing so had handed her a fragile and profound trust. The final miniature was of the clockwork bird. Eleonora saved it for last, pouring all of her skill and newfound understanding into the tiny image. She captured the gleam of the silver, the sorrow in its bent wing, the defiant beauty of its brokenness. When she painted the final stroke, a sense of both triumph and loss washed over her. The bargain was complete. She arranged the 12 miniatures in the velvet-lined rosewood case he had provided. They were a silent symphony of a house and a life, each one a perfect, heartbreaking note. She sent a message to the Duke that the commission was finished. He came to her studio that evening. He did not look at the case immediately. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. The air was thick with everything that had passed between them, every quiet conversation, every shared silence. "It is done," she said softly. He opened the case. He studied each miniature, his face a mask of control, but she saw the faint tremor in his hand. He looked at them for a long time, a decade of unspoken words condensed into 12 tiny images. Finally, he closed the lid. "They are more than I could have hoped for," he said, his voice hoarse. He walked to his desk and unlocked a drawer. He removed a bank draft and placed it on the table. £10,000. A fortune. Her freedom. "The bargain is fulfilled, Miss Vance," he said formally, the Duke once more. "You have my profound gratitude." She looked at the paper, the neat script promising her a new life. Then she looked at the man before her, trapped by a pride as unyielding as the stone walls of his house. He had built this beautiful, sorrowful bridge to his mother, but he could not bring himself to cross it. He would send the case by courier, a final, impersonal gesture. The wound would remain unhealed. In that moment, Eleonora saw her choice. It was not between poverty and wealth. It was between the safe, solitary life she could buy and the terrifying, uncertain possibility of healing something that mattered more than money. She had spent her life being invisible, a passive observer of other people's lives. But Julian had seen her. He had given her a voice through her art. Now she had to use it. She pushed the bank draft back across the table. "The bargain is not fulfilled, Your Grace." He looked at her, his eyes narrowing in confusion. "I don't understand." "These paintings are not just a record," she said, her voice shaking but firm. She placed her hand on the rosewood case. "They are a message, and a message must be delivered by a person, not a courier." She met his gaze, her heart pounding a wild, defiant rhythm. "They belong with her. I will see them delivered." He stared at her, stunned into silence. The sheer audacity of her statement hung between them, a penniless spinster, dictating terms to a duke. But she held all the leverage now, not blackmail, but the moral weight of the truth. She held his confession, his grief, and his only hope for peace. Without waiting for his permission, she picked up the case. "I will leave on the morning coach," she said. She turned and walked out of the room, leaving the Duke standing alone with her refusal, with the £10,000 that could not buy him what he truly needed, and with the echo of the most decisive act of her life. The journey to the coast was long and arduous, but Eleonora felt a strange sense of calm. For the first time, she was not drifting on the currents of other people's decisions. She was steering her own course. She arrived at a modest, windswept manor overlooking the sea, a place of bracing salt air and crying gulls. The Dowager Duchess was frail. Confined to a chair by a window with a view of the turbulent grey water, but her eyes were Julian's, dark, intelligent, and guarded. She received Eleonora with a weary sort of curiosity. Eleonora did not offer a lengthy explanation. She simply opened the rosewood case and placed it on the lady's lap. "He sent you your home, Your Grace," she said softly. The Duchess looked down, her trembling fingers tracing the edge of the first miniature, the library. A single tear tracked a path through the fine wrinkles on her cheek. She spent nearly an hour looking through them, touching each tiny painting as if it were a holy relic. She looked at the wisteria, the teacup, the ballroom. When she got to the final image, the broken clockwork bird, a sound escaped her, a sob caught between a laugh and a gasp of pain. He remembered, she whispered, looking up at Eleonora, her eyes shining. My foolish, proud, beautiful boy, he remembered. 1 year later, the cottage was small, but every window opened onto a view of rolling green hills. Sunlight streamed into the main room, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and falling across a work table cluttered with brushes, pots of pigment, and discs of ivory. Eleonora sat at the table, a fine brush in her hand, adding a speck of white to the eye of a painted wren. She was not a ghost here. She was solid, real, the architect of her own quiet life. After delivering the miniatures, she had quietly disappeared. She had taken a small portion of her own savings and rented this cottage, hundreds of miles from London's gossip and the suffocating weight of her past. She painted what she pleased, birds, flowers, the expressions on the faces of the village children, and sold her work through a discreet agent in the city. She was not wealthy, but she was independent. It was a freedom more precious than any fortune. A horse's hooves on the lane outside made her look up. A lone rider dismounted at her gate. Her breath caught. It was him. Julian looked different. The severe discipline was still there, but the edges were softer. He was thinner, perhaps, and the lines around his eyes were deeper, but the profound, haunted stillness had been replaced by a quiet watchfulness. He opened the gate and walked up the path, stopping a few feet from her open door. He held his hat in his hands. "I hoped I might find you here," he said. His voice was the same, yet different. It held a warmth she had never heard before. "Your Grace," she said, her own voice steady. "Julian," he corrected gently. "My mother. She passed in the autumn." Peacefully, we had 2 months together. She kept your paintings by her bed until the end. He swallowed, the motion visible in his throat. You gave us that, Eleonora, a gift of time, a gift of peace. You healed what I was too proud to even touch. He took a step closer. He was not here as a duke making a proposition. He was just a man, his heart in his eyes. He did not offer her a title, a house, or a fortune. He offered her nothing but himself. "I spent a year putting my life in order," he said, "facing the ghosts I had allowed to rule me. But none of it felt complete, because the bravest, truest person I have ever known was not there. I love you, Eleonora Vance. I love your quiet strength, your honest eyes, and the way you see the truth of things. I am asking if you will let me be a part of this life, the one you have so beautifully built for yourself." Her own eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of a joy so profound it felt like sunlight spreading through her chest. She had found her own worth, not in a title or a marriage, but in her own choices, her own art. And he had come not to possess her, but to join her. She did not answer with words. She simply stepped aside, opening the door to her small cottage wider, inviting him in. He smiled, a true, unguarded smile that transformed his face. He stepped across the threshold into her world. Love, she realized, was not about being seen by society, but about being truly understood by one person. And in the quiet light of her studio, surrounded by her tiny, perfect worlds, their new life was about to begin.